All right, great.
Mm.
We're live, Alexander. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Obviously, keeping on top of all this news, and there is so much news, and it's in so many different places and in so many different forms that it's not always entirely easy to keep up with all of it. But it is interesting. I mean, just to give a few minor details, Boris Johnson is now heading to the Gulf. He's going to try to talk to the Emiratis and the Saudis, and apparently they're not particularly keen to meet with him. And it was an incredibly difficult meeting to set up. But anyway, we'll see what happens. Then we've got the announcement about Saudi Arabia looking to accept payment for some oil in Chinese RMB. By the way, I should say I prefer to use RMB to refer to the Chinese currency, or renminbi. But anyway, so we'll see what comes of that. But that looks to me like a massive piece of news. There's also the fact that the Russians are now steadily doing exactly what Tom Longo said, which is that they're moving the ruble onto a gold basis, and it seems to be working internally in Russia. There's all that going on. But of course, the focus always still remains Ukraine. And that's, I'm sure, where we spend both of us most of our time, poring over all the information, trying to get on top of what's going on there and the fog of war about the actual battles, which is not always easy to work out because so many places we would normally go to are now restricted. But I think we're beginning to get a fairly clear picture. And then, of course, there's the major topic of this program, which is the diplomacy, which is to all intents and purposes, the diplomacy between Ukraine and Russia. The Ukrainians have been trying to find mediators. They've floated the West at various times. They floated Turkey. They floated China. They floated all sorts of people, Israel even at one point. It seems that the Russians are insisting that the talks must be bilateral. They must be entirely between themselves and the Ukrainians. And we see constant wavering and going backwards and forwards on the Ukrainian position. Though I personally think that step by step, they're gradually being forced to come to the inevitable conclusion that this can only end in one way if Ukraine itself is to survive.
Yeah, well, step by step, but time is running out, and I can't for the life of me at this moment in time see Russia giving back areas like Kherson and Mariupol, possibly Odessa, all of the Lugansk and Donetsk provinces, Kharkiv. I can't see them, even if Zelensky does somehow get the okay from his puppet masters to strike a deal.
Yes.
I can't see that territory going back. That's my own personal opinion. Obviously,
it's not. It's my opinion.
We're not in the head of Putin or these guys, but
no, exactly. But we're not involved directly with the Kremlin. But we've got a little clarity today about what the Russians and the Ukrainians have been talking about, and that is very interesting. And it shows us that the Ukrainians are bending, though they're not yet breaking, and that there is also a tug of war going on. Trying to keep them on side. I mean, we'll talk about it in a moment.
Okay, we'll talk
leaders going there.
Okay, we'll talk about it first. Let's welcome everybody who's watching us from Odyssey, from Rumble, from YouTube, and our great locals community. The Duran.locals.com is where you can always find us, in case who knows what. But the Duran.locals.com. And we've got chats going on all of those platforms as well. And welcome to our amazing moderators. I saw Lady Cosmica, was formerly known as Cosmic Rain, but now Lady Cosmica. Welcome. And I saw the one and the great Spartan warrior Queen, and of course, the one and only Zarael, the legend known as Zarael. And let me see who else is moderating. Alexander, and then we'll just jump right into the topic. By the way, Alan Watson, how can you forget the super Alan Watson? And that is okay. Yeah, those are our moderators right now, but I'm sure we'll have more moderators jumping in. Thank you for everything that you do, keeping the chat moving along and keeping the chat friendly. and civilized. Alexander, you have your Q&A tonight on locals. Yes, you want to give a quick plug for that?
Absolutely. I should say that this is on locals, and it is a Q&A. It lasts for an hour and a half. What I propose to do is I'm going to go straight to questions rather than provide any preliminary discussions, because we'll be covering a lot of those issues in this program now. And by the way, just to say that this program will be for about an hour and a half. The program we're doing now will be for an hour and a half, and then I will be doing a further hour and a half on locals, exclusively on locals, at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time if you're in the United States, 1900 hours London time if you're in Britain, and you can calibrate your watches if you're somewhere in Europe. But obviously it will be, to some extent, a follow-up to this live stream, but also, people are free to ask other questions too.
Yeah, and we'll get into our topic, and we'll see how much time we have to answer super chats and other questions from the chat or from locals.
Yes.
And always, if we don't get to the questions in this live stream, we will have our Q&A for the next day. We put up a Q&A just literally about an hour ago, where we went through all the questions, and it turned out to be a very interesting Q&A session, and they turned out to be very interesting videos and shows. So let's jump right into it, Alexander. We have, I don't know if Ukraine made the offer to have a neutral status like that of Sweden and Austria. I don't know if Russia made the offer. I'm hearing from the Russian side of things that Ukraine put it on the table, that they will be happy with a neutral status like Austria and Sweden. I stress again, that is coming from the Russian side of things. And then we got the announcement literally 30 minutes ago that Ukraine, the office of Zelensky, with a statement said that they reject becoming neutral like Austria and Sweden. So did Ukraine offer it? Was it offered to them? Does it really matter? No, they reject the status. They reject a status of something along the lines of Sweden and Austria. I don't understand what would be so bad to have a neutral status like Sweden and Austria. It sounds very logical and plausible to me. I don't see the problem with it. Obviously, Zelensky, in my opinion, is not calling the shots anyway. So whoever is above Zelensky told them don't accept. The situation on the ground is tightening. I'm very worried that Putin and the Kremlin is going to stop this tiptoe soft approach with Ukraine, and they're going to go a lot harder into the country in order to achieve their goals. We know as a fact that Putin has ordered the Russian military not to enter the cities. I don't know if that's changed, but we know the first 3 weeks of the operation, according to Peskov's statements, that there's a little bit of it. Can you tighten your headphones, Alexander?
Yeah,
a little bit of an echo. Okay, great. Okay, yeah. So we know that the order was given not to enter the cities. I don't know if that's going to change. Peskov did say that Russia pretty much reserves the right to change that tactic and start to go a lot harder into the country with the military operation. The East, I think everyone understands that this big Donbass army in the East is surrounded, and it doesn't look good for them at all. They're running out of supplies, oil, gas, food, water, everything. Things are getting desperate there. Mariupol is getting mopped up, and I hear that that's about to enter Russian hands very, very soon. And all of Kherson, the region of Kherson, is now in Russian hands. And well, if all of that gets cleared up, then Putin and the Kremlin are going to turn their attention towards the west of the country, towards Kiev, towards Odessa, and they're going to free up their resources to focus on those areas. Things are not looking good for Zelensky. But my belief, Alexander, before I pass it on to you, is I believe that Zelensky and the people who are ordering Zelensky around, they continue to dangle this possibility of NATO, of entering NATO, or of NATO getting involved, which I think is tragic. Because it just means the destruction, the demise of the Ukrainian state. But they keep on dangling this to him, and we saw this in the form of Poland, Czech, and Slovenia prime ministers and leaders going to Kiev.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, talking about NATO entering the conflict.
Yeah.
I don't know why they keep on pushing this NATO thing,
yeah.
but they keep on dangling it to Zelensky. I also think that they're waiting for one of two possibilities in order to somehow pull off a Hail Mary type of miracle situation in this conflict. And one of those possibilities could be a false flag.
Yeah.
And the other possibility could be the no-fly zone, NATO actually saying, you know what, we will get involved.
Yes.
Regardless of a false flag. So
yes.
They're waiting for something like this to happen. And they're waiting for this, like I said, this Hail Mary type of miracle to occur. But you know, I just don't see it. But I am worried about the false flag. Anyway, that's the situation pretty much as what's going on with Ukraine. Alexander.
I think that's an absolutely perfect summary. Now, can I just say, I have absolutely no doubt at all that it was Ukraine that suggested neutrality on the basis of Austria and Sweden's status. Now, I say that because that is actually favorable to Ukraine itself. Sweden and Austria may be neutral in the sense that they're not part of NATO, but in every other respect, they are completely integrated into the Western systems. They're both members of the European Union. They both have strong armed forces, Sweden especially, which are again integrated into the Western system. They're both countries which, as part of the Western system, have imposed sanctions upon Russia. They're signed up to all the sanctions packages that we're talking about. From a Russian perspective, these two countries are not neutral at all. I think I want to make that absolutely clear. There are certain restrictions to what they can do. They can't have NATO bases, for example, on their own territories, but that doesn't make them fully neutral in the way that the Russians, I think, want Ukraine to become fully neutral. And I've been reading the comments of Medinsky, who is the Russian chief negotiator. And I think it's absolutely crystal clear to me, if you read these comments carefully and objectively, that neutrality of the sort that Austria and Sweden have for Ukraine would not be acceptable to the Russians. They're looking for something much more, distanced from the West than that. But that points clearly to the fact that it was the Ukrainians who must have proposed it, because, as I said, it's not an idea, I think, that the Russians would themselves accept. Now, the fact that the Ukrainians then, a short time after, announced that they were withdrawing that proposal from the table, I suspect has one of two explanations, and these two explanations are not mutually exclusive. Explanation one is that the Russians would have told the Ukrainians, look, this is an idea, it's forward movement, you're accepting that you can't be part of NATO, that's something that is good for us, but this doesn't go anywhere near far enough. And that might have provoked the Ukrainians when they were confronted with what is, in effect, a rejection from the Russians, a rejection which, however, leaves the door open for further discussions about Ukraine's neutral status. That may have been what provoked the Ukrainians to say that they were essentially taking this proposal off the table. I would add that Medinsky, this is the Russian chief negotiator, has said that as part of any neutrality agreement, the size, composition, and status of the Ukrainian armed forces, whatever armed forces Ukraine would be allowed to retain, would also have to be a part of that discussion, which already, as I said, sets Ukraine at a different position from a Russian point of view, from Sweden and Austria. So it could be that the Ukrainians were dismayed or decided to take the proposal off the table when the Russians said, look, it's progress, but it's not what we're going to accept. We want much more than that. So that may have been one cause. But I'm afraid that I think you are also right in that I think that there are still hardliners in the West who are telling Ukraine, hold firm, you can't give up on NATO. We're doing everything we can to get NATO involved. You mustn't wobble now. You mustn't show weakness. We're still with you. And what happened was we had this visit to Kiev by these leaders of these three East European countries. I think I'm right in saying that they were Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Or was it Slovenia?
Slovenia.
Exactly. So they all went to Kiev. And my own view about this is, first of all, let me just say, first of all,
the highest level of, the Prime Minister of Poland. These weren't like lower level officials.
I know, not just prime ministers, but in the case of Poland, there was the prime minister who went there, and also the deputy prime minister, Jarosław Kaczynski, who is the person everybody knows is the true leader of Poland. He gives himself the position of deputy prime minister, but he is in fact actually the person who runs the thing. And it was Kaczynski who came up with this extraordinary idea of a NATO peacekeeping force being sent into Ukraine, which is in effect a call for NATO to become actively involved in the military in the fighting in Ukraine. So I think what they did was they saw all these wobbles coming out of Kiev. They were becoming concerned at the direction of the negotiations were taking. And so they went to Kiev to bring Zelensky and the Ukrainians back into line. That is the best explanation I can think of. And note that Charles Michel, who is the president of the European Council, appeared at one point to say that this was an EU initiative, that these were countries going there on behalf of the EU. But then a few hours later, I think when it became clear what these East European leaders were all about, the EU itself distanced itself from this mission. So I think that you can see that there is this tug of war going on, the hardliners wanting to keep Ukraine resisting, trying to leverage some kind of intervention by NATO on Ukraine's behalf in this conflict. The Ukrainians starting to sense that this isn't really working for themselves, but at the same time, pulled, if you like, by their East European friends and unable to follow through on some of the comments that they're making. And all of this, even as the military situation for Ukraine is deteriorating. So as you rightly say, it looks like Mariupol is days, perhaps a week, probably less than a week away from falling. And there's said to be 14,500 Ukrainian troops there. Now, that's a figure I obviously cannot confirm, but there are apparently lots of Ukrainian troops trapped in Mariupol, and they're about to be either defeated or forced to surrender or something of that kind. And then there was news this morning that there's been another collapse of Ukrainian forces in and around the town of Severodonetsk, which is further north, and which is the other hinge, if you like, in the door that links, the two parts of the Ukrainian defenses in the Donbass. And whilst this military collapse is taking place in the Donbass, you also saw that Zelensky reshuffled his generals. He sacked the general who was in charge in Donbass. He's been reassigned to Kiev, and his deputy has now taken over. And that, to my mind, given that we're only less than 3 weeks away from the start of this fighting, you don't sack the officer commanding in the middle of a battle if you think he's doing well. It suggests to me a lack of confidence in the situation in the east. So the Ukrainians are being pulled in both directions. They at some level, I think intellectually, they understand that they have no choice but to come to terms with the Russians. At the same time, they're getting these false counsels, especially from some of these East European states, telling them to hold firm, and that NATO will ride to the rescue, despite the fact that the Pentagon is clearly deeply opposed to that whole idea. And the result is this extraordinarily chaotic negotiation process. Now, to come to your last point, I think that the Russians are working to a timetable. I think they have a timetable. I don't remotely know what it is. I think that they're probably going to give this process a week, probably not more than that. If there isn't substantive progress being made in those negotiations over the next week, we're going to start to see a much more active period of hostilities. We're going to see the Russian army moving in from the Donbass into central Ukraine, cutting off Kiev. We're going to see all those forces that have surrounded cities like Chernigov and Kharkov, and to a great extent Kiev itself. They're going to start to be activated. What Peskov, Putin's spokesman, said about the fact that the Russian military had been given orders not to storm the cities, I can actually remember that the Russians said something essentially along those lines on the very first day that the hostilities began. They said that they would not target civilian infrastructure, they would not attack residential areas, they were only going to attack military installations. So clearly there was a policy not to try to storm the cities. But Peskov has now modified that. He said that in certain situations, if things don't go according to plan in terms of the negotiations, then the Russians might indeed start to take a more forceful approach towards the cities. So it seems to me that unless we see this NATO force trying to intervene in Ukraine over the next week, which, by the way, would be a calamitous decision with totally disastrous, unpredictable consequences. Unless we see that happen, then it seems to me, unless there's a breakthrough in the negotiations, then the situation for Ukraine is going to become absolutely desperate.
What is the goal of these countries, these East European countries like Poland and Czech Republic, Slovenia, and other East European countries that want to continue? At least that's what it looks like. I'm not saying this is what they want, but it looks like they want to escalate this.
Yes.
What does a country, for example, like Poland gain from this? Because they're the ones that are getting hammered with refugees. If things get worse, they're going to get even more hammered with refugees. They're not going to be able to sustain this. The European Union is not going to be able to sustain this. The whole thing is going to completely collapse. And if they do escalate this by putting NATO peacekeepers, which is a crazy idea, by trying to put NATO peacekeepers in,
for an intervention force. I
mean, that's it. I mean, you're looking at an all-out war in Europe. Period. So I don't understand what Poland's endgame is. I mean, Poland is now saying that Russia should be removed from the G20 and they should take their spot. Okay, fine. Poland wants to entrench itself further into the. Well, they want to entrench themselves further into the Atlanticist system. I get it. No problem there. But why do they want to escalate? If I was Poland, if I was Romania, if I was Czech Republic, Hungary, where I think Orban has taken the right approach so far. He seems like the only sane European left. If I were these leaders, I would say, you know what? Let's take a step back. Whatever Russia's going to do is going to do. Let them speak with Zelensky. Let's try to figure out a solution, and then let's work together to create a stable Ukraine entity or new entity, whatever this will be, because I still believe Russia's not going to give this territory back. They're taking down the Ukraine flags. They're putting Russian flags. Absolutely. I think this land is lost. That's my opinion, though. I don't have any facts or anything. I'm just stating my opinion.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that later in the program.
And they should sit there and say, let's work together to stabilize this Western region.
Yes.
I mean, that seems like the most logical approach.
You are completely right. If the Polish government was acting in Polish interests, that is precisely what they would do. They would be seeking some kind of negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia in their own interests. They would be looking to achieve peace and stability on Poland's eastern borders. The fundamental problem is that if you're talking about Poland, if you're talking about the Polish government, It's led essentially, as I said, by Jaroslaw Kaczynski, who was the deputy prime minister, who has convinced himself and some other people in Poland that the Russians killed his brother in that airplane crash on the way to Katyn. I mean, all those years ago. He's about the only person and his little group of people who believe it, but he's convinced himself of it. And this is on top of a visceral antipathy that he has to Russia that goes back, well, not just to the period of Soviet rule over Poland during the Cold War, but arguably even before that. And he is one of these people who I think in Poland is still attached to this idea, this policy that goes back to the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s, what some Poles call a Promethean policy of tearing away all of these countries, Belarus, Poland, whatever, from Russia, creating a new sort of bloc with Poland at the center and pushing Russia ever further eastward away from Poland itself. And what is happening is that, of course, the opposite is happening. So there was that attempt to stage a color revolution in Belarus, which failed, and that's brought essentially the Russians back onto the Polish border, where they'd barely been before. And now, of course, what Kaczynski and people like him are seeing that is instead of the Promethean policy that they had invested so much in, which, by the way, only a tiny, insignificant minority of Poles are signed up to. But I get the sense that Kaczynski is an absolute convert to it. Instead of that policy playing out, the opposite is happening. Instead of the Russians being forced east, they are coming ever closer to the West. So that's what that's all about. So they're trying again to involve the West, to try to make through the West a policy Poland lacks the power to fulfill by itself, to make it real. And it's incredibly dangerous. And I'm afraid it again shows the lack of realism, I'm using words objectively, of some East European leaders who obviously have, genuine concerns about Russia, which I completely understand. But instead of trying to achieve a stable, long-term accommodation, seek instead all kinds of elaborate policies of, creating pro-Polish, pro-Western client states in Russia's Western regions, so that, that will push the Russians out of Europe once and for all and forever. It's a policy that ended in disaster in the lead up to the Second World War. And I'm afraid if it's pursued, it could easily result in disaster this time. I want to stress again, and I appreciate there may be people in Poland who are watching this program. I don't believe that the vast majority of Poles are remotely signed up to these ideas. But Kaczynski himself is, and that's the trouble.
Well, you don't need a large majority. You don't even need a small majority. Look at the United States. You don't have a large majority of Americans who are signed up to the Russophobia. All you need is a Newland and a Sullivan and a Blinken. That's all you need. And there you go. We're in this mess. And we're in a big mess.
You're in a very big mess. And of course, if you have a tradition, if you have a subculture of hostility to Russia within your country, which we do in Britain and we do in the United States, and which we also have in Poland for much better and far better founded historical reasons, then of course those minorities are able to play on that to pursue these policies, which are, as I said, ultimately completely self-destructive and self-defeating.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to the financial side of things, the sanctions side of things, the energy, the energy side of things is probably a better way to describe it. Saudi Arabia is looking to do some business with China, and they're looking to do it in the renminbi, the yuan. You like to say the RMB. I'll say the yuan. And this is huge news. This is absolutely massive news. We have India, and they're working with Russia to trade in rupees and rubles.
Yes, but
it is a de-dollarization.
Referenced again to the RMB.
Yeah.
I mean,
okay.
It will work. The system will work on the basis of the conversion rates of each of these currencies against the RMB.
Right. The petro yuan is what many people are calling it, right?
Is what we're looking at. Exactly.
That's what's happening. And yesterday, we put up a video with a discussion on the Sullivan meeting with China, and I read you a passage from Sputnik News, which said that you have this Eurasian Economic Union as well, maybe like 6-7 countries, say, which are also doing the same thing. They're building a structure and a framework to transact in the RMB. The writing's on the wall, and the fact that Saudi Arabia is even considering it is stunning. The fact that Boris Johnson is running to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE to essentially beg them to increase their production it leaves me speechless, because I think to myself one very simple thing. If the Biden White House and the European Union and the UK were dead set on imposing these historic sanctions on a G20 nation, they didn't plan any contingency. They didn't have any backup plans at all. They're having to go now to Venezuela, to Iran, to Saudi Arabia, and beg them to help out. I mean, it is the equivalent of saying, you know what, I'm going to quit my job today, Alexander, and I don't have any other backups. I don't have any other skills. I'm completely useless, but I'm going to quit my job, and I have no savings. I have nothing, but I'll figure it out. These are not leaders of powerful nations. No, at all. And this whole thing is driven by emotion and hate and ideology and virtue signaling. And I'm sorry, TikTok videos are not going to get the US or the UK or Europe out of this mess. No, I think Jen Psaki thinks the TikTok videos are going to make a difference, but they're not. This is a massive, massive problem for the US and for the entire Western architecture.
Absolutely. Now, can I just quickly deal with the TikTok thing? I mean, it was, first of all, it was asinine. It was one of the most ludicrous things I've ever encountered. I mean, it was just an idiotic idea. But note that it was done on the eve of the meeting between Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi in Rome. Now, given how the Chinese feel about the TikTok affair, I mean, that was not, I think, a diplomatic thing. And there's already been coverage about this in the Chinese media. And the Chinese were furious about this because, of course, the TikTok episode is a very raw nerve, strikes a very raw nerve in China. And, of course, it reminds them that just as the US has seized the reserves of the Russian central bank and previously of the Afghan central bank, well, they in effect seized TikTok. I mean, that was something that, as I said, it is not a clever move. I mean, rub salt in the wounds in that kind of way. But anyway, that's a minor thing. The big thing is exactly what you said. I mean, if you are going to go down the route of starting to cut yourself off from Russian oil, if you're thinking about that, then the first thing you need to do is to talk to the other producers to see whether they're in a position to make up the difference. And if they are, whether they are willing to do it. And that means having proper consultations with the Saudis, the Qataris, the UAE, Iran, all the other, or even Venezuela, if you like. You do that before the sanctions. Now, we were getting reports before the sanctions were announced that Western oil companies had been contacted. And those Western oil companies were coming back and were telling the US government that we cannot make up the shortfall. If the Russians are cut off, we simply don't have the means to make up the shortfall, given the already tight market. Now, if you don't get that answer from the companies, you go to the countries, the oil producers. And they didn't. They didn't consult MBS in Saudi Arabia. They didn't consult his friend, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi. And of course, they didn't square things with Iran. Now, Bojo going to the Gulf, as you say, begging for audiences with all of these people. I mean, first of all, it is an extraordinarily bad image. And secondly, I predict these people will listen very politely to what he says, say a few nice things, and, well, we've already had the response from the Saudis. They're opening a massive refinery in China with Chinese assistance, and they're moving part of their trade into the RMB, part of their oil trade into the RMB, something which you would never have seen before. And we've now had visits to Moscow by the foreign minister of Qatar. This is the country that was supposed to replace all the provide us with all the LNG that was going to make up for Russian pipeline gas. And their foreign minister is now in Moscow. We had an incredibly friendly meeting with Lavrov, and they seem to be entirely on the same page. And we've just also had another visit to Moscow by the foreign minister of Iran. And again, an incredibly friendly visit. They say, yes, it's all been sorted out with the JCPOA. The sanctions won't impede us. We'll be able to trade normally with each other. So we have a situation where they clearly hadn't thought it out in advance. They're now having to meet. They're trying to go and meet these leaders. Note that they're not prepared. These Arab leaders are not prepared to talk to Biden himself. Bojo is going there. They're not prepared to give this to Biden. Why should they give it to Bojo? He might come away with some nice words, but I don't think the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Qataris are going to do anything to help the West out of this mess that it's got itself into.
Yeah. Listen to this, Alexander. Germany reacted sharply to the idea of Polish Deputy Prime Minister Kaczynski to send an armed NATO peacekeeping mission to Ukraine. The German government is against sending any NATO military to Ukraine. For Berlin, this is a red line.
Yeah, of course it is.
There you have it.
Well, there you have it. I mean, the Germans did send their armies into Ukraine. They did it twice. They did it during the First World War, and they did it during the Second World War. And it didn't turn out very well for them on either occasion. I have to say, even with all the changes we've seen in Germany, I cannot imagine the Germans doing something something like this. So, it's unrealistic. It's fantastical. And, it needs to be dropped. And people like Kaczynski coming to Kiev and talking like that is utterly self-destructive. And people like Bojo, as I'm going to call him, Boris Johnson, going to Riyadh and crawling in front of MBS is humiliating and pointless as well. So I think we need a bit of a dose of reality, actually. And look what's happening in the financial markets now. I mean, the Fed was supposed to start tightening. We're going to have all this tightening because we got runaway inflation. It's now at 8%, almost 8%. That's the official readout. Others say it's much higher. I believe it really is. But they were going to try and bring it under control. They were going to keep it. They were going to start raising interest rates over the course of this year. Well, it seems that the only interest rate rise that they're going to do now is one of just 25 base points. In other words, it's not even given inflation is rising. That means that real interest rates in the United States are now falling. They're not going to be able to tighten. And why can they not tighten? Because the situation in the financial markets is now so precarious, made even more precarious by these latest events, that if they tighten in the way that people have said, well, it will provoke a bust. It really does risk a bust. And, I've been talking to various friends of mine. I've been talking to Mitch Feinstein, who obviously has his own point of view. I've been reading what people like Schiff, not the representative, but the person who's all into gold, have been saying. None of them thinks that interest rates will even reach 1% in the US because the problems are too high, too great in the financial markets. So that inevitably means inflation in the US is now going to go even higher. So that's where we are. And Mitch Feinstein said to me, what do I always say? You can't get out of a Ponzi scheme when you are one. I've always said they won't raise interest rates. Well, because we've been having an argument about this, and well, it looks as if once more he's going to be right. So we are in a hole. We've got to stop digging. We need these negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians to succeed. The Ukraine that's going to come out of those negotiations is not going to bear any resemblance to the Ukraine that existed before. And your point about the Russians never leaving Kherson, I absolutely agree. Lugansk, Donetsk, I agree as well. Whatever Ukraine comes out of this will be, in effect, a satellite of Greater Russia. The alternative is to let this military process continue, at which point there will be no Ukraine at all. So that's the choice now.
Yeah, and the Western mainstream media is not reporting one bit as to what's happening in the east of Ukraine, and that really, really worries me. I mean, complete media blackout. All they're talking about is Kiev. That's it. A little bit Kharkiv, maybe a little bit Kharkov.
I agree. Yes.
And a sprinkle of Mariupol. I'm being honest, but 99% of it is Kiev. And if anything, they have all their reporters in Lviv talking about Kiev. I'm not saying all the mainstream media channels, but most of them.
Yeah.
This really worries me. Zelensky speaking to Congress tonight worries me. He spoke to the Canadian Parliament yesterday, and what was he talking about again? The hypocrisy of NATO and the fact that we haven't seen a no-fly zone. He's pushing, he's goading for a no-fly zone. Someone's telling him to push a no-fly zone. I mean, someone's giving him the script to push a no-fly zone, and he is saying no-fly zone. I mean, he's performing the part that he's been commissioned to play, and he's doing it. Yes, and this worries me as well because you are seeing a financial and economic collapse.
Yes,
not only in Russia but in Europe and the United States. Yeah, the ruble is actually strengthening, so that plan didn't work at all.
No.
And you're seeing energy shortages. You're seeing you're going to see food shortages, precious metals, you name it. Fertilizers. You're seeing a collapse across the board. Yes, you can't raise interest rates. You mentioned that. The only way out of this for them is, yes, to get Zelensky to agree, but they're not going to do that because they never go in reverse. They never have a reverse gear. These guys, these crazies. And that leads me to one option that's going to come into play, and that is the false flag. Yes, and they're going to say, let's go all in. And the only way they can go all in, the only way they can manufacture consent from the public is with some sort of false flag. And that scares the hell out of me because I believe a lot of people in the US and in Europe will buy into the false flag narrative.
Oh, yes. I mean, they always have done. But you're absolutely correct. And it scares me because I mean, and I've been reading. I mean, I read in the Financial Times, which is in media terms now in Britain, and it really saddens me to say this neocon central. I mean, it's become the major voice, both of the administration, the US administration in Europe, the major media voice, and it's always also become, to an extreme degree now, the voice of the neocons in Europe, and by the way of the anti-Trumpians as well, just to throw that in as well. But anyway, I was reading an article just this morning in which they were talking about, that we mustn't fall into the same trap that Obama fell into in Syria when he announced a red line and then refused and failed to enforce it. And this time, if there is something like that, we must do something. We're not quite sure what that something should be, but it might be something. And then we've had articles by, yes, our old friend Tony Blair. Remember him? He's also now resurfaced. He's also saying, you know, that the Biden administration was in too much haste to rule out all sorts of options, or, you know, even if they're right to do so, maybe they shouldn't have spoken out so strongly about ruling out those kind of options, military options. And you can see that there is this groundswell of people in Europe, in the United States also, of course, who, as they see their entire enterprise fail, because it's failing, they're beginning to get really, really nervous. Now, let's just talk about how it's failing. Firstly, Ukraine itself is losing. I saw a video last night. I was watching a video last night from Fox News, and there was a really hard-bitten, old-style reporter, Steve Harrigan, something like that, who'd just been in Ukraine. And he came back and he said, you know, it's flattened. They're losing. The Ukrainians are losing. And that was on Fox. So there are people who are starting to understand that Ukraine is losing this war and is losing fast. So that is failing. So they're worried about that. The other was the financial shock and all that we were talking about, the collapse of the ruble, the collapse of the Russian financial system, the revolt of the oligarchs in Russia. That's failing as well. The attempt to strangle, to suffocate Russia with oil, that's turning out to have all kinds of unpredictable effects, which are still ricocheting around the world. And the Russians are steadily working now towards setting up alternatives with India, eventually, no doubt, with China, with the Asian countries. We're going to start to see a rearrangement. So given that this project is failing at every level, and as you say, these people have no reverse gear, what do they do? And we have these crazy ideas about peacekeeping forces, which are not really peacekeeping forces. We have also people like Tony Blair coming along, talking about, you know, we were in too much haste to rule out these kind of options. And we have the Financial Times resurrecting the myth that Obama somehow balked from enforcing his red lines in Syria, and this time we must act and act firm. So it is extremely worrying because, of course, this is against the nuclear power. Against that, and I really have to say this, we have the Pentagon, which is clearly dead against any military intervention in Ukraine. And we also have countries like Germany, which I think the German government, weak, incompetent, stupid, to say it straightforwardly, as it is, I think it's now starting to understand that by greenlighting that disastrous decision to freeze the assets of the Russian central bank and to sanction the Russian central bank and to de-SWIFT some of the Russian banks, all the things Germany said it wouldn't do, that they've got themselves onto a runaway train and are beginning to get nervous and are trying to find ways to get off. But there we are. That's not comforting, that we are depending on the Pentagon, on a weak German government, on sentiment in Europe, and I should say popular sentiment in the United States. I mean, go back to Robert Barnes, that heroic live stream we did last Friday, or in which he pointed out that there is always in the United States this anti-war default position amongst a large part of the US electorate. And I think, again, if we start to get sucked into a military confrontation with Russia, or steps start to be taken in that direction, and I'm sure Robert Barnes here is right, you will see mood in the US change, and change suddenly and radically. But having said all of that, It's not comforting that it is in fact very alarming that we are so close to this point.
Let's want to get some questions.
Let's do some questions. Yeah.
All right. Let's jump into some questions. And wow, what a time we live in. From Raul, European bonds will have to find a natural buyer of debt much sooner than expected, one that is far more price sensitive than the ECB. Your thoughts?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I saw a similar point taken made in zero hedge. Actually, there was a point about this in zero hedge. I mean, there are going to be some people who will buy these bonds. I mean, there always are people who buy bonds like this, but I think that the EU is going to find it more and more expensive to do that, because I come back to what I said. These decisions which have been taken over the course of this February and March, this March 2022, by the way, is going to be the month, one of those months that will be remembered throughout history. It's going to be like July 1914 or, August 1939. It's going to be one of those historic months. All of these disastrous decisions have left Europe in an impossible, unsustainable economic situation. And sooner or later, eventually, people are going to start looking at the position of the European economy, and they're going to start to say to themselves, do we really want to start funding this European economy through Eurobonds?
All right.
And they will find it much more expensive to do it.
Okay, Orama, thank you for that super sticker. Kaliu25, thank you for that super sticker. Alan says, God bless Russia, God bless Serbia. You too, Alex, are the best. Thank you very much for that. And from Hugo, question, does the selective reporting of mainstream Western media, aided by the commentary of the likes of Fukuyama, Stephen Kotkin, etc., actually pave the way to a false flag? They paint a picture of a weak and desperate Russia about to lose the war. Thus, a staged chemical attack, nuclear threat forces supposedly the hand of NATO.
That is exactly what it does. That, to a very great extent, is its purpose. Now, I don't want to suggest that every one of these journalists who is reporting it in this kind of way is, party to this. I'm sure that lots of these people, holed up in Lviv and in Kiev, being fed all of this information and reporting it back to their newspapers, generally believe this. They're really mesmerized by the presence of these Russian armies outside Kharkiv and Kiev, and they like to write stories about how the Russian offensive is stalled. I mean, that's the famous expression. But the fact that their editors, the fact that the US government isn't highlighting the war in eastern Ukraine and redirecting these journalists there and telling them, look, this is where the real struggle is happening, that is an extremely ominous sign. And again, it shows the lock grip that the neocons have over the information space in the media, in the legacy media. And of course, that precisely leaves open the possibility for the sort of things that you were talking about. And it is surely intended to leave a space for those sort of possibilities.
All right. Commander Crossfire says, if a false flag and tensions rise, could or would China intervene to stop all-out war?
Well, yeah, to a certain extent, the Chinese would I'm sure do whatever they could. But what exactly are the Chinese going to do in that kind of situation? Let's assume that there's supposed to be a NATO leaders meeting next week. Let's say that meeting comes up with the idea of announcing a no-fly zone, and US fighter jets are then sent into Ukraine, and the Russian missiles start shooting them down and all that sort of thing. What does China do? Does it telephone Biden and tell him stop? And if Biden won't stop, what exactly does China do? Ultimately, this is a military conflict, and China is not involved in the military conflict. The Russians are.
Right. Alfred Tired 62 says, Alex, I believe the Americans may buy into the false flag until their children begin being called up to go fight and die for a war started by the globalist bankers for the clear purpose of centralized power and monetary advancement.
Yeah, I agree with this. And I think that's exactly the point that I made before. Initially, I think a lot of people will be swept along. I do think that at that point, the doubts will actually grow. And if there is a demand in the US from the usual suspects for another confrontation, this time with the Russians, well, we saw what happened in Syria over the Syrian crisis in 2013. There was this upswell of opposition, groundswell of opposition across the US, which came from below. And I think something very similar would happen this time. But, would it be enough? Would it be effective with a weak president, with the neocons obviously in a position of enormous influence? I don't like to speculate about these possibilities, but I'm afraid we have to. And I'm afraid I think we're far too close to that danger point for comfort.
Well, I think one of the effects that missile strike had near Lviv that took out, I hear some accounts say 30, others say 200 foreign fighters, mercenary trainers, call them whatever you want. One of the effects that it had, and I don't know if it was intentional or if it was just just one of those things, was that you had a lot of foreign fighters come out and say, "Don't come into Ukraine, don't do it, don't do it." Now, I can't authenticate a lot of the messages that have come out there. I don't know if maybe it's fog of war, maybe the Russians are putting those messages out there, maybe they're putting the videos out there, but a lot of the videos that I've seen, it seems authentic. Once again, I can't verify that at all. So I always tell everybody, when you look at this information, look at it with caution. But the message that these videos are transmitting, and a lot of them have gone viral, is I was there, I was around that area, stay away. Stay away.
I'm hearing the same thing. Can I just say a few things about that incident? Now, again, I can't corroborate this, but I understand that the 35 people the 35 deaths the Ukrainians confirmed are Ukrainians. The majority, and it allegedly, and I have to say allegedly because I can't corroborate this, runs into hundreds were foreign fighters. Now, what is indisputable is that there have been reports in the British media, not just reports, they are confirmations in the British media that ex-British special forces people were in Ukraine and have been killed. Now, they might have been killed in this strike, they might have been killed elsewhere, but there are already people like that who were sent to Ukraine and who are dying. And I mean, there was a big article about this, I think, in the Daily Mail. I think it was on the front page. So this is indisputable. Now, I have to say a few things about this. If we're talking about ex-special forces people from Britain, ex-SAS people, I don't know that they were SAS, but I suspect some of them were, then I think it is all but inconceivable that they were sent to Ukraine, that they went to Ukraine without getting a green light from the British government. So that's the first thing I would say about that. And that would suggest that there was an attempt to send people to Ukraine, British people to Ukraine. And you're absolutely right. This missile strike, and for all we know, other things that we don't know about, because lots of things go on in war that we're never informed about, or informed about only very incompletely, and sometimes long after the events took place. All of these do seem to have dampened enthusiasm for some of the things that have been happening up to now.
Boy, the UK has really gone all in on this.
Yeah.
I mean, they've gone all in on this conflict.
Yes.
It's not going to end well for Boris.
No. Well, for Britain. I'm
saying Boris because this must be some like a political calculation as well. I don't know, but it's just not going to end well.
No. But I mean, I'm not particularly bothered about what happens to Boris at this moment in time. I'm worried about Britain, which is my country. I mean, we've been dragged into a war which I think is just has nothing to do with us ultimately, and which we have played a very, very big role, by the way, in provoking. Why could we? I mean, Boris today has actually come out and said, that Ukraine has no prospect of gaining NATO membership anytime soon. What does that even mean? Why doesn't he say Ukraine will never be a member of NATO? Why didn't he say it a month ago? In which case this war would probably have been avoided. This was a conflict which ought to have been settled diplomatically. And we played in Britain an absolutely key role in preventing that from happening.
Yeah. Pathetic Albion says Iran has had a very busy week and has suggested in the media that a stronger Russian-Iranian security ties are essential. Given the polarization we are seeing internationally, is this a realistic development?
It is a completely realistic development. The foreign minister of Iran has just been in Moscow. He's given a massive press conference with Lavrov, and all that you've just said is there. I think it's happening.
Yeah. I would have said if they played their cards right, the collective West, this wasn't going to be a realistic alternative. But now the fact that we've had all of this happen, now it's a given. Iran is going into this new financial and international structure. It's a given.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree.
Gregory Casey says Novorossiya, together with territory extending northwest from Odessa to the top of Moldova, was split from Galicia, with borderline extending northwest from Moldova to just west of Chernobyl. That is the dividing line.
I agree. And I'm going to come now to the point that Alex made. And at the start of this program, I think in lots of places that the Russians have moved into, they're not going to pull out, not in any substantive way. I am absolutely sure that let's assume there is a negotiated settlement to this. As the negotiation progresses, first we get Ukraine accepting neutrality, neutral status, then the format of the Ukrainian army will be decided. Then there will be the recognition of the secession of Crimea and Donbass. And then we're going to start getting special status for places like Kherson, Kharkiv, all of these places, and expect to see Russian peacekeepers there. I think that's that is absolutely the flow of travel. And who knows, a Novorossiya type setup may very well follow. And a partition of Ukraine, conceivably, a sort of central area around Kiev, perhaps left with some kind of ephemeral independence. I don't want to try and predict the future too closely. But like Alex, I don't believe that the Russians are ever going to go. I mean, places like Kherson, places like Nikolaev, which has still not been, by the way, attacked by the Russian military, places like Mariupol, places like Donetsk and Lugansk, obviously, places like Kharkiv, places like Odessa, to vast majority of Russians, these are Russian cities. And once the Russian army goes there, I don't think they will ever want to pull away.
Yeah, I agree. FBI Glowboy says, morning, gentlemen. Not sure if you were asked this yet, but which conflicting report on Saudi dollar decoupling should we believe? Also, if true, do you believe it's a serious threat or a leverage play?
I don't think it's a leverage play because it's too dramatic a move to be just a leverage play. Besides, why do what do the Saudis want at this moment in time, which they would achieve by doing this? I mean, they can simply withhold oil and simply say to the US, well, if you want us to come to your rescue, then you've got to do A, B, C, D, E, and F. Why would they need to throw in this business of the RMB sale, and of course, this RMB trade, and why also would they need to agree this big refinery deal with China in place of a refinery deal, by the way, which they were offered with the US? I think it's real, And, I go to oilprice.com, which is the place I usually read, which is the industry news website. And they take all of this as true. And I'm sure it is.
Yeah. DJC says Korean Peninsula model? ? Perhaps. But
well, perhaps. I don't think so. I don't think the Russians will want dividing lines like that. Well, what I do think, and we discussed this in a segment which you can find on Locals, by the way, Alex and I, prior to a live stream that we did. I don't think the Russians will go into Lviv. I don't think they have any interest about going into Lviv. It's strongly anti-Russian. It has its own culture, its own religious traditions. It's very different from Russia, and it's very hostile to Russia. And people have a right not to want to be part of Russia. And I think in Lviv, they emphatically do not want to be part of Russia, and they would resist becoming part of Russia. So I don't think the Russians are going to go there. And I think it's possible, in fact, quite likely, that at the end of this process, we could see that area of Western Ukraine detaching itself and forming some kind of separate state. And if it does, I wish it all the best, and I hope it prospers and becomes happy. But I can easily see that as a potential outcome to this. But for the rest of Ukraine, I absolutely do not think the Russians want a Korean Peninsula model. I mean, they would certainly not want anything like that, because the Korean model is actually an unstable one. It's an unstable one that survived all those years. But I mean, you have missiles being launched and nuclear weapons created. I don't think the Russians want anything like that anywhere close to their own borders.
Yeah. Danish says the Russians will stay in the Ukraine east of the Dnieper River. Exactly. Yeah. And Liv Sovereign says, as an expat inside Ukraine, I absolutely believe any foreign fighter who spent a couple of days in Ukraine would be looking for a way out as fast as possible. Thank you very much for that insight.
Well, there you go. And that's from Ukraine itself. So there you go.
That's from Ukraine itself. Thank you very, very much for that. Dan Noya says, NATO, quote, I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair messed, but I do say no more than 20 to 40 million killed tops. Thank you, Dan.
That's a Dr. Strangelove.
Just Strangelove, exactly. Fantastic super chat, Dan.
Yeah.
John Edwards says, Ukraine has long been a central figure in U.S. dirty politics. What made this country so attractive to Western corruption?
Well,
it's corruption. Its own corruption.
It's corruption. By the way, again, can I just talk up one of Alex's brilliant updates? He's pointed out one of them who the Russians have sanctioned, and suffice to say, one of the president's sons that we've been hearing so much about, who had this wonderful, interesting job, became a gas industry specialist and was given a directorship in an East Ukrainian company. There he is on a Russian sanctions list. So one wonders what the Russians know about him.
So my question to you is, what does it tell you that Russia sanctions Hunter Biden, who has no connection? Well, he's not in the government. I don't want to say he doesn't have connection. He's not in the government, but they sanction him. They sanction Hillary Clinton, who's not in the Biden administration either.
Yeah.
They sanction many Canadian officials.
Yeah.
And what do they say when they sanction them? Because these Canadian officials were aggressive and they have Bandera-like tendencies, because they're Banderites, referring to Stepan Bandera. What does it tell you about what are the Russians signaling in this way by sanctioning these people? To me, I mean, it's like they're saying, we know what all of you guys have been up to. I mean, that's what it feels like to me.
That is exactly what it is. But I think it's actually more than that. I think that all of these people have connections. I mean, real, practical, material connections in Ukraine. And what it's telling them, those people, is that those material links, connections, assets, whatever you like, well, you can forget about them, because you're not getting them again. I think that these sanctions have a real bite to them. I mean, they're not obviously comparable to some of the sanctions we've seen from the West, but I think that it does mean that the flow of donations to the Clinton Foundation is going to slow from some parts of the world, from Ukraine and from Russia. and especially from Ukraine.
Exactly. Tonoyota Vianney says, the Google News algorithm is floating talk about Russian default. Is that a possibility, or is it just fake news?
No, it's not fake news. Except I personally wouldn't qualify it as a default. I mean, this isn't my area of speciality. I should say that, but or rather, it never was my area of speciality. But if you create a situation where you make it impossible for somebody to pay their debt by basically seizing their money, then I don't think this is a default. I think this is a force majeure type situation. So I think what the Russians are going to do is they're going to say, look, we're going to pay. We give instructions to the corresponding banks in the West, which hold all our frozen assets, to pay you the debt. If the banks in the West refuse to do that because they're sanctioned, well, the Russians will say, well, look, we can only pay in rubles because we're prevented from paying in any other way. And then if the creditor comes back and says that's a default, well, the Russians could, I suppose, at that point, either start legal proceedings to contest that it's a default. You remember, in order to carry out a default, in order to seize assets, you have to bring legal proceedings of some kind. And then you could get all kinds of third-party litigation. Now, I'm not going to predict this because obviously political litigation, this would be litigation happening in a very fevered political context. But it will be very complicated. And I'm not going to try and predict exactly how it's going to work out. But I would not be surprised. In fact, I think it is highly likely that some of these Western creditors, having received the instruction, having been copied the instruction from the Russians to the banks to pay out the money in hard currency, they will come round and they will actually bring claims against Western governments to try to get the sanctions lifted to the point of allowing the hard currency to be paid to them. I don't want to, but it is a mess. It's another mess. And again, I wonder whether anybody really understood what it means.
What a mess. All right. Yeah. Novus, thank you for that super chat on Odyssey. Thank you for that. And let's see. Commando Crossfire says, quote, if offense come out of the truth, better is it that the offense come than the truth be concealed.
Oh, yeah.
The offense.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
That's absolutely true. By the way, that's a legal principle.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Ed Gardis, thank you for that super sticker. Valies in the house, the great Valies, thank you for that super chat. Thank you for moderating as well, Valies. Alan Shepard, thank you for that super sticker. 2 super stickers from Alan Shepard. Thank you very much. The Big Red Bear says, hold on, they just rejected the neutral status they were flirting with. Are these people drinking antifreeze and pee? Because that's insane.
I have to say this. Yeah. I mean, this is completely true. I mean, obviously trying to nail the Ukrainians down to anything is impossible. And Putin told, I think it was Charles Michel, the EU, the utterly incompetent president of the EU Council. I think he said to him yesterday that, the Ukrainians are not negotiating seriously. And here you see the proof. They float a proposal for neutrality one day, and then they reject it themselves the next.
Yeah,
but if they play this game,
they're not making the decisions.
They're not making the decisions. If they float this, if this game is floated for too long, we're going to end up in one of 2 scenarios. Either Ukraine is going to be destroyed, or we will have something which is starting to look altogether too much like the first steps towards World War III. And I mean, that is a really, really scary thought.
The longer it drags on, the more you risk some sort of event that's going to trigger a World War III type of scenario.
I don't think, I still think that, sanity, I mean, not sanity, the need for self-preservation will prevail in the end. And we're not going to go to the second. But in that case, then the outcome of all this prevarication is that Ukraine will be destroyed.
Yeah. And you have a man in the White House who's obviously also not in charge And
no,
right
he's
now,
not in
the
charge.
Pentagon is holding things together. And I think there are sane, level-headed people in the Pentagon that are holding things together. But you have to ask yourself, how long can they hold it together?
Well, absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. And, I get to say something else. I mean, I don't like to say that, go into personal things, but he's an old man. He's far from in control. I also have to say this. I think he has a very unpleasant side to him as well. And he gets angry and he makes decisions in anger, which is a very, very dangerous thing.
Yeah. Jane, thank you for that super sticker. Tim, thank you for that super sticker. Jamie Lee says, the U.S. going away from having our own gold and using SWIFT as a weapon one too many times. I believe China expected this to happen when Russia entered Ukraine. Excellent point.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. I think the Russians, by the way, certainly, I'm not sure whether they expected the attack on their central bank. I mean, that is such an awesome thing. I thought it was a possibility. I wasn't sure it would happen. I'm not sure whether the Russians thought it would happen, because this is so far off the rational that you can't always predict the irrational. But I think that in terms of SWIFT, I think in terms of everything else, the Russians expected most of this. And I think the Chinese probably not only expected, but were ready for pretty much all of it. I mean, the very fact that Russian banks are now apparently issuing debit and credit cards, which are connected to China's Union Pay system at an incredible speed.
Yeah,
I mean, they can't have done that without the Chinese having green lighted it.
Exactly. You always got to remember the judo, not the chess, but the judo mentality of Putin.
Yeah.
I think they expected a lot of this. Maybe not the central bank stuff.
Yeah.
But a lot of this blowback, they probably game planned this out.
Yes.
Just a thought.
That's what I think too. Yeah, that's what I think too.
VPlan says, I'm very grateful for your work and analysis. Thank you very much, VPlan, for that. Freedom Autopsy Report says Nikolaev is going to fall to Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very important city from Russia. By the way, I have never been there. I've never been to any part of Ukraine. But I'm told it's a beautiful place. And of course, it was one of the most important shipyards, both of the Russian Empire and of the Soviet Union. And it's one of those places we don't know much about in the West, but, to Russians, it carries great resonance.
Yeah. Freedom Autopsy Report also says that the neocons are going to die on Warmonger Hill. Mm-hmm. The problem is that they're going to take us down with them.
Well, indeed. I mean,
that's the problem.
That is the massive danger.
Yeah. Francis, thank you for that super chat. To David S., thank you for that super sticker. Lady Cosmic says, feeling a bit rough today, but not so rough as to donate support for the Duran. Please keep up.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Thank you. RDDR says, Donbass tried to separate in 1918 through the Donetsk Kryvyi Rog Soviet Republic. I read it was accused by Ukrainian communists of sabotaging subordinates.
You are absolutely right. And the story there is enormously complicated. And one day, I think that it probably repays a full discussion. And of course, Alex and I have had to interrupt our history series, but we have every intention of resuming it. And that is an excellent place to discuss all this issue and to do so in detail.
Yeah. Summer of 1970 says the American sheeple still outnumber the American people, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Raul Pinto says the sanctions were meant to cause unrest in Russia to take down Putin. Seems like the reverse effect will happen in the West and to their democracies. His approval rating I've read is anywhere between 72 to 78%.
And so it's rising still. I think what it was supposed to do, the universal expectation was that the currency would collapse, there would be hyperinflation, the financial system would break down, the banks would close, and that would create a massive crisis within Russia, which would lead to Putin's downfall. I mean, we did a program about it. We said financial shock and awe, and the objective is regime change. And it's not worked. It's not, or at least for the moment, it's not working. And the more time passes, the less prospect there is of it working. So, given that that is so, because these people have no reverse gear, the danger is that they're going to double and triple down. They try to do it again with the oil embargo. The Europeans said we're not involved. The Germans said no. The US announced an oil embargo, though it turns out, I'm told, by the way, I can't corroborate this, that embargo on Russian oil imports is actually fungible. You can still buy Russian oil from Western or non-Russian middlemen. So I'm told. I don't know whether that's true. But for the moment, that's not worked either. And with time, of course, world trade flows start to restructure themselves. So what do? You've thrown everything you can. It's exactly what Alex said. You've thrown all your cards on the table. They're not playing out as you expected. So you're now getting desperate and you're coming up with more and more because these people have no reverse gear.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm getting from Telegram. Max Blumenthal recommends that the Duran, another show they did with Colonel McGregor, a great show they did with Colonel McGregor. And Gray Zone, Blumenthal, Aaron Mate, Dr. Steve Turley, Robert Barnes. A lot of channels have, not a lot, Jimmy Dore. There are a handful of channels. Yes. Obviously, Gonzalo Lira, a handful of channels, Felix Rex, Black Pigeon Speaks, that have done an excellent job of covering this story.
Absolutely.
And if I'm missing any channels,
and we're grateful. And we're grateful to them for any kind words too, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And they've done a great job of covering the story. Nitswitch says, "Thank you, Alex, for calling out my government as stupid, Germany, because that is exactly what they are."
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
I've never known a government as weak as this and as
Merkel
bad
would not
as
let this happen.
No,
I say I'm not a fan of Merkel, but she would not have let it get to this level.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, this only happened because she wasn't there. By the way, there's a lot about this whole affair that we don't yet know and understand. When the history of this whole episode is written out, we're going to learn all kinds of things. But the fact that Merkel left the scene, I'm sure it was a pivotal event to the way to the fact that it took place.
Yeah, from Odyssey, with Zelensky cacking about all sorts of things, particularly the no-fly zone. Is it in Russia's interest to take him out fast? Is time on the Russian side? This is actually an excellent comment from Reg, because my question to you is, the Russians know where Zelensky is.
No, of course,
I mean, they know where he is. If he is in Kiev, because there's a lot of rumors he may not be in Kiev, but I think he's there.
Well, they know
his exact location, and they don't take him out, and they don't want to take him out because I imagine they want a deal from the government.
Yes, they do. But of course, the point is this: if it becomes increasingly unlikely that deal is ever going to come, then that calculus may start to change. Now, I think that there is a certain Russian restraint about killing leaders. I mean, which is very different from the West. If you remember when we started the Iraq War,
that's a good point.
They went after Saddam Hussein immediately, and they were doing the same with Gaddafi. I mean, I'm not just mean the way he was killed at the end, but if you follow the pattern of the bombing, they were clearly targeting Gaddafi's residences and hoping to kill him. So, but I think that the Russians up to now have avoided going down that road. But again, you are demanding an awful lot of the self-restraint of some people. In war, restraint tends to sort of break down. So far, and I get to say this, some people are not going to like what I'm going to say, but so far the Russians have shown an extraordinary degree of forbearance in the way in which they've conducted this war. I mean, we would not have conducted it in this way. But how long will that hold?
Yeah. Novus says, by the way, check out Patrick Lancaster on Odyssey at Patrick Lancaster News today. Great on-the-ground reporting in Ukraine, and one of the only ones. Be warned, some very graphic material. It's a war zone, kind of to be expected, but is still warning. Not affiliate or anything. I just appreciate it. Yeah, Patrick Lancaster's, I agree. He's done a fantastic job on the ground. I mean, it would be great to have him on, but obviously he's doing reports on the ground as well. And also Scott Ritter's done a great job of reporting this from a military perspective. George Galloway has done a great job of reporting his fantastic shows as well. So a lot of different,
on
some channels are coming to mind.
Not all of them, but some of them. But and so there is good reporting out there.
Yes,
but of course it's confined to a few places, and the big media outlets aren't really doing it to the extent that they really ought to be.
Freedom Autopsy Report says the U.S. military balks at war because it is blood and guts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the fundamental difference. Soldiers know what a terrible thing war is. And I think for the people in the Pentagon, the people, not all of them, but, the sort of leading the leading people who are certainly in charge of the nuclear deterrent forces, who I've seen them giving testimony, and I was impressed by them. I thought they were very clever, level-headed people who understood very well the awesome nature of the weapons that they are in charge of. I didn't see any General Turgidsen's there. I mean, I really want to make that point. So I think those people are a force for sanity, but they ultimately operate within the chain of command. If they get the order from the president, what do they do?
Yeah, agreed. Ivan, thank you for that super chat. Emery Chen says, does globalist equal liberal hegemonist? If not, what are your thoughts? One, the likes of liberal hegemonists like Kurt Volker.
Yes. I mean, if I may say so, liberal hegemonists equals globalists. But of course, globalists are a lot more than just liberal hegemonists. They're a lot more than just that. And I mean, there's a whole economic and financial dimension to it too. But all of this, neoliberalism, hegemonism, globalism, they're all tied up together. And Volker who was, by the way, if I may just tell people, he was the Trump administration's special representative on Ukraine, and I thought a demented figure, actually. He fits in entirely within that network.
Yeah. Trump and his weakness towards the neocons. Here's a quote, Alexander, from Vladimir Putin. Just came in on Telegram. All assigned tasks in the special operation will certainly be solved.
Yeah.
And the West is trying to convince its citizens that their difficulties are the result of Russia's actions, but this is a lie.
Absolutely true. I mean, I have to say this. I mean, he's absolutely right. If we're talking about inflation, one of the most grotesque things has been this attempt by Biden to blame the inflation on Putin and on Russia. I gather that went down so badly that even the Democrats have now stopped saying it. But I mean, it was a ludicrous thing to do. So far, the Russians haven't counter-sanctioned in any significant way. And by the way, I suspect that they're saying to themselves, we don't need to, because what the West is doing is it's sanctioning itself. I read a report on, BNE Intelligence. It's a economics magazine, very anti-Putin, by the way, which covers Eastern Europe and Russian affairs from a very anti-Putin position. And it talked about the West, or at least the Europeans, forming a circular suicide squad, shooting themselves. And that's exactly what they're doing.
Devrod said, is there a chance of NATO provoking a limited nuclear war with strategic nukes? 1 KT, this way they could just write it off as really big bombs.
I don't believe it's going to happen, but the very fact that we're talking about this possibility at all would have astonished me and frankly scares me.
Yeah. PT Low says, can China's foreign reserves be seized by the U.S. in retaliation for its support of Russia?
Well, if they did that to Russia, Why can't they do it to China? As I said, when you start taking steps like seizing central bank reserves and disregard the fundamental international affairs principle of sovereign immunity, then, I mean, logically, morally, there is no limit to what you can do. And I've heard people like Paul Krugman in the past. I mean, I always thought it was insane what he was suggesting, but suggesting that if the Chinese wanted to start selling treasury bonds, the US would just freeze Chinese holdings of US treasury bonds. And I remember reading him saying this a decade ago and thinking to myself, this man is, this is insane. And what he's actually saying is that the US should default on its obligations to China. And this will never happen. Well, I can't say that with any confidence anymore. All I will say is this, of course, if the US starts doing things like that, then, I mean, we are in economic and financial Armageddon. I mean, that would be economic war on a scale we've never seen.
Andres 52, thank you for that $100 super chat. Thank you so much for that. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Gus, thank you for that $20 super chat. Thank you so much for that. Olive says, you must read the latest article by Alexander Duran on this topic. It's good. Duran or Dugan?
Right, okay. I think, is it Dugan or Dugan?
I think Dugan, maybe.
Probably Dugan.
Anyway, I think it's Dugan.
I will read it. I mean, I always find him interesting.
We'll look for it. Yeah. We will look for it. Let's see. Bauke John says, Pepe Escobar had an interesting article on the Cradle yesterday. He addressed who is responsible for the frozen Russian assets. Where exactly they are seems to be somewhat of a mystery.
I'm going to give I read that article and I want to just clarify a few things, which I think he's not fully understood. Russian gold reserves are held in Russia. You know, the gold bullion that Russia has is held in a big depository in Moscow. Russia also holds Chinese RMB in Russia, and various a significant part of its reserves also in Russia. It's about, some say around 40% of its reserves were held in overseas Western banks. Now, there are reasons for that which are connected to the legal enforcement of reserves. So if you're holding, for example, US treasuries, then you might be required to hold them. You might have to be able to hold them in Western bank accounts in order to do your job as a central bank of financing the trade of your country, of supporting your currency in particular countries. It's part of the normal operations of a central bank. Having all your reserves in your own country restricts your bank's operations. Now, so I think Pepe, who is a brilliant political and geopolitical writer, doesn't, I think, always understand financing and how finances work. But it's simply not practical to have all your reserves within your own country, or hasn't been up to now. Now, I actually think this question of the reserves is overstated, because the major problem that the central bank has, and what makes it very difficult for it to act in foreign markets and to pay money to Russian creditors, is not that its reserves are frozen. It is that Western banks, financial institutions, companies are forbidden as a result of sanctions from having any dealings with it. So even if, for example, the Russian central bank were to contact a Western creditor and say, look, we're prepared to pay in gold currency, which you can do. You can send gold coins, for example, or bullion or whatever it is. The Western financial institution is not allowed to do it because it is restricted, and you can't have middlemen doing it either because they're affected by secondary sanctions. So that freezes up all of the operations of the central bank.
All right. Freedom Autopsy Report says the Democrats are going to be voted out in November and see a war as a wild card to keep power. Better to rule over ashes than not rule at all.
I'm afraid you're right. That's completely true. I agree with that. Yeah.
Nitswitch says Putin always did what he said. What does the American think when Putin says that he will target the puppet master behind it all? Don't they see that he meant it? Do they think they are unreachable?
Absolutely. Well, we'll see what happens. I mean, Putin has never shown any desire up to now to take personal action against Western leaders. But I hope that doesn't happen. But we are now in a ladder of escalation. We're an escalator of escalation, and who knows how far that will go.
Yeah. Edward Turner says, I believe Russia will take Odessa before any agreement is made, possibly allow a corridor for access to the Black Sea for Ukraine. Yeah, I agree with that.
That's highly likely. I agree with that, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. The English Loyalist says, this lashing out of the Biden admin is driving our allies and partners away, like India. Are we going to see more countries leaving U.S. influence?
Absolutely.
I think you made a statement last live, Alexander, that this conflict, this crisis has been a way for India to really enter the stage of being recognized as a great power. I mean, India is one of the big stories of this crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no sign of that changing, by the way. The Indians are clearly going to continue with the policy they have. And James Saki was saying they're going to try to persuade the Indians to change their position, and the Indians basically said get stuffed, which, I mean, it tells you a lot.
Yeah. Alexandria says, would you have Dutch MP Thierry Baudet on? He ran the anti-Ukraine referendum that got ignored. Yes, we would actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've done many reports on Mr. Baudet. Absolutely.
If he wanted to come along, we'd be delighted. Yeah.
It would be our honor and pleasure. Sanjeva says, thank you, Duran, for providing a community for me to find peer and emotional support in. If not for the Duran, I definitely would have gotten depressed at these moments of crisis. Thank you for thank you, and stay safe. Thank you very much, Sanjeva, for that. Fragile says, Tony Blair is a prescription for disaster. Look what happened to Yugoslavia when he got involved. Serbs would never forget nor forgive this man.
I completely agree. And I mean, why are we even paying any attention to him? I mean, to my mind, this influence that this man has on British politics, which was particularly potent, by the way, during the Brexit war, after the referendum, when he played the leading role, as I now know, in trying to get the Parliament to block, basically block Brexit, block the outcome of the referendum. This power that he has is both inexplicable to me and extraordinarily dangerous.
Yeah. G.A. Freckles, welcome to the Duran community. William Reed, thank you for that super sticker. Freedom Autopsy Report says, what do you think of Republic World? I think that's a channel. I don't know it, but we'll take a look at it.
We certainly will. Absolutely.
John Edwards says, George Soros, go. George Soros has his fingers all over this from the time of the coup and before. So, yeah.
Yes.
William Reed, thank you for that super chat. Sparky says, the West has thrown away its financial stability and credibility, while Putin and Russia make extra effort to honor financial and contractual responsibilities.
Well, yes. And as I said, trying to create an artificial default. I mean, I've never heard of this. What is an artificial default? Because that's what this is. I mean, it's not a default at all. I mean, you can't say somebody has. I mean, I'm trying to understand the legalities of this, and I really don't. Truthfully, don't.
Yeah, it's bizarre. Teodoro, thank you for that super sticker. Rainy Step says, don't worry, Justin Castro will fix everything.
Of course he will. He's already on the job. That's why we're in this wonderful. That's why we're in this wonderful state we're in.
He's now sanctioned. Yeah. Let's see. Nick Beardian says 6 of our 16 ICBM aircraft were showing in U.S. airspace last evening. Do you think this is a flex? We are still on DEFCON 3 yellow, so nukes ready in 15 minutes.
Yeah, I presume it is a flex.
Harry C. Smith says, did you hear about the 2 military UAVs crashing on NATO soil? One in Romania and one crashed in Zagreb, both from the direction of Ukraine.
Absolutely. Now, the one in Zagreb was definitely Ukrainian, and apparently it had explosives on it, and it was a old Soviet era 1970s drone, and apparently astonishing that these utterly obsolete things are still around, and that Ukraine still operates them. But I think that was clearly intended to create the impression of some kind of missile strike. That's my guess. I'm not an expert on these things. The other one was apparently a very small Russian drone. When I say small, you can actually hold it. You can actually, it's small enough that you can carry. And I presume that it must have flown off course and somehow kept flying. Now, or possibly somebody in Ukraine retrieved it and then buzzed it on. But anyway, the first incident looks disturbing. The second incident, I don't really take terribly seriously.
Freedom Autopsy Report says, do you think this is a Western Slav versus Eastern Slav thing?
I think there's some element of that, but I think also, if you want me to say, I think that, and I think this is a point to bear in mind when we look at the eventual resolution of this crisis, that this has to some extent been a family quarrel amongst Eastern Slavs. So there's Western Slavs well, I mean, I don't know whether Western Ukrainians count exactly as Western Slavs, but anyway, they're a different culture and mindset. But if we're talking about Central Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, there has been a sort of a family quarrel amongst the Slavs, which I suspect in time, left to itself, will be resolved.
Yeah, Graham Phillips actually did a video. He described it as that. The three sisters, he called it. The Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. The Russian side of Ukraine.
Yes. Yes.
David March says, as a minor politician in Canada, the Polish-Ukrainian community is one of the biggest and oldest political blocs in the country. Think Irish times 5.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. I know, no doubt about it. I've come across some of these people. And by the way, can I just say that when I have consistently found them far more strident on this issue, on Ukraine, than Ukrainians from Ukraine that I've encountered.
AD says, revenge for all what happened in the last 30 years is in the background of the Russian operation. These diplomatic talks no longer reflect their actions, so we can expect anything.
I think there's some truth to that, by the way. I think that there is a lot of truth to that. I think if you look at Putin's comments, they are particularly strong.
Oleg T says, do you think Ukraine will be split into a confederation of many people's republics like LNR and DNR?
I'm not going to guess, but I'm going to say this. I don't think it'll be a Ukraine like the one that existed before, if there is a Ukraine at all at the end of this process. That, of course, always assumes that, we don't have something disastrous go wrong in the meantime.
Ralph Peterson, thank you for that super sticker. Elaine Magson says, Zelensky is pleading Congress for a no-fly zone.
Yeah, I know. Absolutely. Yeah. I saw that. I mean, we all know that's going to happen.
We all know that.
Yeah.
Freedom Autopsy Report says Biden cannot control his bowel movements. How can he control world events? There's some truth to that. WYOWY says, is this playing into the WEF hands? Maybe part of their plan. U.S. financial system is in such chaos, and Biden admin still sending aid.
There is so much discussion about this. It's all over the internet. And, does it play into their hands or does it not? I think it doesn't ultimately. I think that what we're seeing is the collapse of a system of globalization, which is what made the whole project possible. And I think that they may imagine they can control the chaos, but I think what will happen in the end is that the chaos will submerge them. That's my own personal view.
Eric says, all the best from Holland. Take care. Thank you very much. And all our best to Holland. Yeah. Bob Evans says, forming an economic cauldron around the West is a reason they aren't doing shock and awe economic retaliation just yet.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, I think the Russians have seen, as I said, the West form a circular firing squad. And I think, they say to themselves, we don't need to do more. All these people have done it all to themselves. First of all, we've got to get our own house in order, which they have been successfully doing. I saw a piece in Zero Hedge, which admitted that, the financial situation in Russia has been stable, which is not, I think, what was anticipated.
Yeah. John Edwards sent another super chat which says, George Soros, go. There's tons of videos that we could make about George Soros and his involvement in Ukraine, but I don't think they'd ever make it onto YouTube. I think it would be taken down. Life of Brian says, they say $2,000 a day for Western mercenaries in Ukraine. Rumors of multiple platoons staffed exclusively with people named H. Biden.
Well, I come back to this. You need. I mean, you can be paid an awful lot of money, but where you might be ending up, that money might not help you very much.
Yeah. Sparky says, fun fact: while growing up, George Soros and his family only spoke Esperanto in their household. Apparently, he's been a globalist since childhood. That's interesting.
I've heard that.
What interesting.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Actually, I've never really got into the details of his past, which is murky, by the way. It's more. There's lots of things about him that unanswered questions. But I've heard about the Esperanto.
Yeah. But other chat about Terry Badut. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Let's get him on. Let's see. John Edwards says, ultimately, is this just a push to create a crisis so the globalist bankers can sweep in and tighten their enslavement of all of us?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think there may be people who think in those terms, and I'm absolutely willing to believe that. I mean, some of these people have a very, very conspiratorial approach to things, and they might very well be saying to themselves, "Look, this is what we can do. We can manipulate everything, and we will end up creating those possibilities." But two things to say. Firstly, if everything does go smash, then I can't see that benefits them any more than it benefits us. That's the first thing. The second is, if we get a financial collapse, which I think is possible, I don't think in the end that's going to be good for them either. So I think they've probably, like people who overplan, probably if they have those plans, they've overplanned this one.
Yeah. All right, let's go for another 5-10 minutes, Alexander, because I know that you have to go, and I have to go, and you have to prepare. Yeah. You have to prepare for your big live stream tonight at 7 o'clock London time, everybody, on the Duran.locals.com. Karen, thank you for becoming a new member. Tarugo, thank you for your super sticker. G.A. Freckles, thank you for that super chat. Oleg says, Russians bring Syrian volunteers to occupied regions for police action because they are more effective there against resistance than Russian soldiers.
I've heard that there was a lot of people from Lebanon coming.
Commander Crossfire says McDonald's left Russia due to sanctions. At this point, the Russians are going to be stronger, richer, and healthier by the end of this. Yeah, I've seen photos that the McDonald's are still operating, Alexander.
I think the same, actually. What's going to happen? Photos. Somebody's just going to... I gather pretty much everything is locally sourced. Yeah. Now, if McDonald's actually leaves, there'll be a fire sale. Somebody will just take it over and run it.
Yeah. I've seen photos of people waiting in line to get their Big Macs and all. I've seen those photos, literally. Yeah. Let's see. Leafy Bug says, the usual Western talking heads interpret the fact that the Russians haven't flattened Ukraine by now as evidence that the Russian military has stalled in Ukraine. You point to the Russians pursuing a dual-track coordinated strategy of diplomacy and incremental military action, and I'm sure you're correct. I would add that it looks like Russia is fighting a just war against people they don't regard as enemies.
The last point is an extremely important one. I mean, bear in mind, people in Kharkiv, Mariupol, all of these places, many Russians see them as Russians. So, the Russian Air Force bombing these people would be difficult to justify in Russia, and it might not be easy, to get the pilots to do it. This is a factor that must not be underestimated.
Liv Sovereign says, if you return to Putin's speech before this action started, it certainly seems like Putin plans to leave a viable Ukraine. Aside from the LPR and DPR, I think Russia would at least hold votes in Kherson and Kharkiv regions to let them decide on their future. Your thoughts?
I think that's true, but always bear in mind that was the speech that he made then. He may have been entirely sincere when he made it, but events, the march of events, can dictate its own logic. I think that having established themselves in Kherson and Melitopol and ultimately Mariupol and quite probably Odessa as well, I think it'll be very, very difficult for the Russians to go.
Right. Let's see. Someone is knocking on my door. Raul says, FT, Ukraine and Russia draw up 15-point neutrality plan to end the war.
Well, that's what the FT says. We'll see.
And Alexander, real quick, I'm going to give you a question and I'm just going to answer a call real quick. Gus Antonis says, U.S. Deputy Treasury Secretary Wally Adereño said on CNBC the other day that the U.S. government is considering blockading Russia trade ships. Any comments on that?
Well, I think that that would be an extraordinary escalation. It would mean using the U.S. Navy in all kinds of ways. And I have to say again, it would be obviously contrary to international law. And I can't really believe the Pentagon being willing to go down that road. But having said that, I come back to what I said before. The president orders it. What does the US military do? It seems to me that really opens up the prospects of a confrontation between the Russian military and the US military and the Chinese, who have been extremely concerned about a blockade being imposed on them, will respond by accelerating their naval programs.
Yeah. Do you think Transnistria will join the Russian state?
Look, I'm not going to predict what's going to happen with places like Transnistria in the future. All I will say is this. If this land bridge to Transnistria is established, which I think is highly likely, then the political dynamics of the situation in Moldova itself will start to shift.
Okay. And one final one we have here is, let me pull it up. Rory says, political prisoners, persecuted journalists, censorship, and an untouchable oligarchy. Russia or the U.S.? God bless America.
Well, indeed. Can I just say, I mean, since we're talking about political prisoners, just to remind everybody, we've done a program about the recent decision on Julian Assange. I regard him as a political prisoner, and I'm very concerned about him.
Yeah, that'll be up in a few hours, that program on Assange. All right. We got everything, I believe. Questions as well. Thank you to everyone who sent us questions. And let me see. Yeah, I think we got everything on Odyssey, on Rumble, and on YouTube. Thank you to our moderators, Valies, Lady Cosmica. I have trouble with that name. Cosmic Rain, I can pronounce it. It's easier for me to pronounce. Let's see. Spartan Warrior Queen, Zarael, Alan Watson, Reckless Abandon is also in the house. Who else? I said Valies. Yeah, that's everybody. Those are our moderators. Thank you to our moderators. And Alexander, any final thoughts before we sign off? Thank you to all the questions and to everyone that joined us as well. Thank you very much. Any final thoughts?
Well, I think the next week is probably going to be, I mean, I said this before, but I think this is going to be the key week. I mean, we'll see whether these negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians come to anything. I had a quick glance at the FT article. Clearly there is a plan, and it's a neutrality plan, and it does seem to be, from what I'm skimming through it, it seems to be very much on the kind of lines that the Russians wanted. Restrictions even on what weapon systems, for example, Ukraine could buy, for example. But the big question is not whether the Russians would accept this, it's whether the Ukrainians will. And of course, that doesn't even begin to address some of the overarching political issues. So unless this agreement is tidied up and signed up within the next week, then we'll start to see a military crisis in Ukraine. And then, of course, the big question is, what does the West do? So we're now in a period of week, 10 days at most, I'd say, when this thing will be decided. It's the most dangerous moment, definitely, in international affairs since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962.
Zelensky tells U.S. Congress if no-fly zone is too much, Ukraine needs planes and air defense systems like the S-300s.
Well, of course, the United States. I mean, well, actually, in a way, that is that seems to be a way of pulling back from the no-fly zone idea. So it's if you think about it, I mean, you say, yeah.
And how are they going to get all that stuff operating and working?
Well, of course not. I mean, it's an absurd notion. Patriot missiles and all that, and this time it's just out of the question. So I would say see that comment as, if anything, slightly reassuring. That's bizarre. But
right.
I mean, it says, well, anyway, we'll see what happens.
Well,
so just to remind everybody, I'm doing my live stream today on Locals. It's exclusive to Rogue to Locals. 1400 Eastern Standard Time if you're in the US, 1900 London time. And obviously, it'll be a follow-up to this one. And by that point, no doubt, we'll have heard more about Zelensky's great speech and address to the Congress and what the responses to it are.
Alexander will answer a lot of questions on that live stream, so don't miss it. Shabs, thank you for that $99 super chat. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Shabs R, for that. And Lady Cosmica says, last donation, and you're pronounced my name right. Cosmica. Thank you very much, Lady Cosmica, for that. All right, Alexander, we have to stop. A hard stop here.
Hard stop.
I will be tuning in, of course, to your live stream in a couple of hours. Good luck with that. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Take care.
Yeah.